Thanks for joining my presentation on ethical storytelling. I'm going to talk about some of the practices and the pillars of ethical storytelling that we have in place at Plant with Purpose. I also really want to talk about just why this is important and some of the big things we have to think through. So I'm Philippe Lazaro. If we haven't already met, I am the creative director at Plant with Purpose. And here's why ethical storytelling is a big deal to me. So stories are powerful. These are a few of the stories, the documentaries that found their way to me back when I was in high school. And they're really kind of the reason why I wound up going into the world of nonprofit work and international development in particular. When I saw documentaries like these, they brought me to a world that was so different than anything I was familiar with. They made me see problems and see how they were affecting people. They made me care. And they really made me feel like, now that I know what I know, I can't do nothing. That's no longer acceptable by me. And so I realized storytelling is a really powerful way to move people. And I've wound up in the position I am largely because of that desire to share that experience with others. That said, when it comes to storytelling, especially in the nonprofit world and especially internationally, there are a lot of things to look out for to make sure we do it the right way. So when I talk about storytelling for Plant with Purpose, I'm talking about the ways we gather people's testimonials, people's experiences from our field programs. I'm talking about the people we work with and their lives before, during, and after their time with Plant with Purpose. We get these stories a number of different ways. Just to run down a few of them, oftentimes our staff visits the field and we get to meet our participants through our local staff partners in that country. It's actually one of my favorite parts of my job and one I miss a lot right now that I can't travel due to COVID. But sometimes we'll go, and in the process of accomplishing certain program tasks, we'll also collect stories and photos and videos. Other trips are more dedicated towards gathering those media assets. So sometimes we'll bring along a professional photographer or a videographer or even a team. But those are some of the ways we get stories. Another way we get them is by having our international partners send them to us. And we really like this because a big part of our ethical storytelling practices is to involve locals as much as possible. And having local partners and country-based leaders everywhere we work really makes that much more doable and much more manageable. That during this time of COVID and of no travel, that's been our lifeline for getting stories to you, finding out how our partners are doing and hearing from them firsthand. And we've gotten several that have been a testament to their resilience. But yeah, those have come through our international partners, and we're continuing to look for ways we can build better systems for equipping them to get great stories. Some of our stories also come from you meaning our community of donors and supporters. See, some of you have gotten the chance to take vision trips out to our programs, and a few of you who are actually quite skilled at gathering photos and videos and have given us permission to use them. So if that's you, first of all, thank you. And just to note that that's another way our stories come in. And so all these different channels for getting the experiences of our partners into us, we want to make sure we're collecting them in the right way and we're using them in a way that's ethical and honoring to the dignity of our partners. As a Christian organization, we firmly believe that all our partners, every person is made in the image of God. And so we want to make sure our storytelling is consistent with that belief. Unfortunately, the nonprofit industry, especially internationally, does not have the best track record of doing this. Images like these might be familiar. I like to think that this sort of imagery of malnourished children in black and white or in stark contrast, looking miserable and desperate, I'd like to think of that as a relic of the past, of like, infomercials from 1980s, 1990s, the time where I was growing up. And while things have gotten a lot better, unfortunately, this is still a pretty common thing I see these days. And another reason why this matters a lot to me is, see, it's unfortunately the marketing departments of a lot of nonprofit organizations that have driven these images, that have driven this narrative of misery and desperation. People in my exact same job. And so I want to make sure I'm part of turning that around and giving us a new way to do this, to tell stories, tell better stories. Scott Harrison, who's the CEO of Charity Water, I really like the way he describes this issue. He says, Nike doesn't advertise shoes. They don't convince you to buy athletic shoes by showing you photos of people who are out of shape, who need to start exercising. They don't focus on just the worst of the problem. They're showing you inspiring images of what you could be, what things could be like, and how their product can help. And we can take note of how that's been really effective for them and use that. Move away from poverty porn. That's kind of the popular term for images like these. And I know it's not a very pleasant one, but I think that's kind of the point of the term, is to bring up how exploitative it is and how ethically icky it can be. The way Emily Regnick describes it, and she works with World Relief, another international Christian organization. She says that poverty porn is the practice of depicting the graphic qualities of a human being for the sole purpose of eliciting an emotional experience and ultimately money. So that's the end game here. It's using these images as fodder for emotions and then money at the end. And that's not to say that you can't use storytelling ethically to fundraise, but you've got to do that in a way that's not just erasing the humanity of people and turning their hardship, their struggle, into something that is profitable. Here's a quote I love. I think it's by Wayne Dyer. He says that if you change the way you look at things, then the things you look at change. And that's so true when you're working in a sphere where you're trying to change big major problems. Look, if we continue to have a perspective on certain countries as poor, if our only image of Africa, for example, is of a poor place and of the people who live there as not having enough, it actually cements our expectations for that's what it's like over there. That's how it has to be. That's part of its identity or image. And that works against our desire to create change in that area. So our Plant with Purpose Mexico program is led by Luis Alberto Castellanos. He's our director and a colleague of mine I really enjoy talking to. One thing he often says is, pobreza es una condición, no es la identidad de una persona. Poverty is a condition. It's not somebody's identity. And that's made me rethink even the simple ways I say things. I put things into words. I've started to become more careful about avoiding phrases like the poor or poor people are more likely to do this or this. There's a big difference between talking about people saying poor people versus people who are struggling with poverty, communities in poverty. On the surface, it might just seem like a little grammatical switch, but it's actually bigger than that, and it reinforces what we understand as the identity of a person. I think it's bigger than semantics. It has everything to do with our perspective and what we see when we see people. Also, is a thing that I just have always found weird. We are so comfortable talking about, large segments of the population as the poor. Does that, by default, make us the rich? Would we be comfortable referring to ourselves as the rich? I don't know. Statistically, globally, we are. But at least most of us watching this likely are. But yeah, that's just an oddity I've come across and had to think through. All right, another learning moment for me was creating some of our content for social media. I once mentioned how the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world. which, if you're looking at poverty rates country by country, the DRC is consistently in the top 5, top 10 at the very least. And so that is true. However, I got some feedback on some of those posts just saying like, hey, what do you mean by that? The Democratic Republic of Congo is really rich in natural resources. Based on its ecosystems, based on its natural abundance, in many ways is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And if you're going to talk about why the people of that country have not experienced the benefits that you might expect from having all these resources nearby, well, there's a cool story there about exploitation and about a history of colonialism that's being erased. And so, yeah, that's created more nuance in the way we talk about cases like that. Is the Democratic Republic of Congo a poor country? It depends. Depends what you mean by that. It depends how we're talking about it. Look, the way we tell stories matters. Stories are so powerful. They shape our impression of places and of people. They even shape our impression of ourselves and where we fit into the narrative. Because of this power, we need to handle stories with care. Every time I'm in one of our partner countries, in one of our project sites, and I'm listening to somebody open up and really tell me about some of the hardest moments of their life, some of the hardships they've had to endure, worries they've experienced, I feel a big sense of humility and gratitude that they are opening themselves up to me and entrusting me with that story. And that makes me feel a big sense of responsibility and ownership of how I use that story. I want to make sure I use it in a way that matches what they would want, their intent in sharing that story, in a way that is true to what they experienced, and in a way that they would feel proud of if they were to hear that story. I want to basically create materials and content off of their stories as if they were ultimately going to end up being the audience for it, or part of the audience for it. As idealistic as this sounds, ethical storytelling is also not easy. There are a number of tensions we've got to work through and think through when it comes to telling the whole story. Let me just run by a few of them. We want to emphasize the skill and courage and virtues of our partners, but we also want to make it seem like it's not all hanging on individual merit. There's actually a lot of complex systemic issues and historical contexts around poverty and their situation. We want to tell stories that effectively raise money, of course, like that is an end outcome. See, we have a program that we believe ultimately helps the situation of the people we're hearing stories from and that they've benefited from. But we don't want to do this in a way that's sensationalistic or that's profiteering off of somebody's lived experience, and where to draw that line. That's a complexity. And I wish I had like a straightforward silver bullet answer, but I don't. It's something that as we think through some of the topics we're talking about right now, we just get more and more sensitive to. Here's another big one for me, hope and urgency. I am a big believer that our stories are hopeful, that there is hope, even in a topic like the environment where you often don't hear about that. I also think that there's a big sense of urgency, that the time to act is now. Actually, it is probably earlier, but the next best time to act is right now. And so I want to continue to invoke that. While invoking that urgency, I also want to highlight the fact that creating long-term sustainable change, the kind we want to see, the kind we're after, isn't just a one-time action. It actually takes a long-term commitment. And so that in itself creates yet another tension. Another big thing I want to do is show that our team is effective and competent and able to make a meaningful impact. Actually, we have lots of data that shows our program is highly effective in an area of critical need right now. And I don't want to not say that when doing so can really help make our services more widely available to populations that need it as well. That said, I don't want us to center ourselves in the story. I don't want us to override the narrative of people who have trusted us. I for sure don't want to frame ourselves as the saviors. One thing I really appreciate from our CEO, Scott Saban, is he's always reminding us that our planet already has a savior. It's kind of a cool thing we get to remember as a Christian organization, right? And our planet already has a savior, and it's not us. And so we don't have to frame ourselves that way, and we can actively try and look for ways to not do that. So, ethical storytelling for us gives us a lot to think about, but I think there are a handful of pillars that most things ultimately come back to. And it's these 6 items here. We want to understand voice, the role that voice plays in storytelling. We want to use images responsibly. Images do a lot of the storytelling for us. It's not just words. We don't want to sugarcoat people's experiences. We want to tell their stories with informed consent. We want to tell them humbly from a state of learning and listening. And at the end of the day, we want to use our storytelling to facilitate connection. Let's dive into these one by one. So how can we better understand the role of voice? I like what Kara Martez says. If we really believe that change can come from any level in society, then we need to seek out and represent those stories at all levels. When you start to question the role of voice and how that impacts your storytelling, you find yourself asking some important questions. You have to ask, who is speaking? For whom are they speaking? Are they telling their own story? Are they telling a story of their neighbors, of their community, of their family, or someone in their program? What are they speaking about? And for what purpose? Why are they opening up with this story? It's also really important to ask who's missing. If we want our storytelling to be inclusive, which inclusive storytelling is ethical storytelling, then we always need to think that there may be somebody whose stories we haven't heard, that hasn't been directly presented to us. We also want to not rely on our own assumptions. We want to be wary and be careful around the dangers of a single story. There's a pretty popular TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend it, and I'll share a link at the end of this presentation. But she shares, one of the many things she shares is her experience coming from Nigeria to go to school in Boston, and her roommate being surprised that she was able to operate a stove, that this was something she had seen before. Her roommate asked her to play the music she would have listened to in her village, and was surprised to hear some Mariah Carey songs. Be careful that we're not shaping our expectations for the stories we tell just around assumptions we've picked up from other places. There are a lot of nuances to think through when it comes to the role of voice. And here are a few of the things to be aware of. Like a lot of issues with ethical storytelling, I don't exactly have the clean, silver, do this and you'll be fine answer. These are more things to be conscious of, to keep thinking about, and to examine what effect they have on the story you're telling. There are nuances in translation. Man, when I went to Thailand a few years ago, the people I met mostly spoke Lahu, and none of them spoke English. So someone would translate from Lahu into Thai, and then my guides who spoke Thai would turn that into English. Sometimes it's like that. Translating comes with a lot of nuances. A lot of words don't have direct English translations. If you're bilingual, you might be familiar with sometimes you have to say things a different way or get creative to explain a certain concept, because there's not always a one-for-one word sitting right there. And it's true with the languages our partners speak. We have to be aware of the limitations of translation, and sometimes there's only so much we can do, but we've got to work at still understanding where they're coming from. Power dynamics is another big thing. To be coming as somebody from a wealthier Western country into a rural area, that impacts the way people look at you and their willingness or their openness with their stories. Again, just something you have to always be conscious of, because your presence there is going to shift their their behaviors and everything. We work with our international partners to make sure that our partners share our same expectations for sharing of their story leads to. It removes some of the tricky stuff that can come up around things like compensation if you've ever done this in another context. It's still a very important thing for us to think through. Same with the observer effect. If you sometimes just knowing that you're being watched changes the way you behave. And so that's something we have to be aware of and conscious of as well. The best way I've found to avoid some of these pratfalls is to do everything we can to let our partners tell their stories in their own words. The less interjecting we have to do and the less setup, the better. Sometimes it's appropriate. Sometimes you need that to create the context so the viewer, the audience has the full experience. But to be sort of a minimalist about this is a good way to preserve ethical storytelling. One example we have is, we've always wanted to include quotes from our partners in products like our annual report. A couple of years ago, we decided why not just have our partners more or less write large portions of it, entire pages. It wasn't quite like they were sitting behind a computer drafting this letter, but when I was in Haiti a few years ago, I asked Dwayla what she would say to everyone who was supporting Plant with Purpose if she had the opportunity to, and asked if you did have that opportunity and I could get your message out there, could I? And so that resulted in her message being a page in our annual report, and her quote is great. It shows so much personality, and she's wonderful, and I encourage reading that and checking it out. So here are some principles around voice and our understanding of it. We want to listen to our constituents' voices, respect their decisions, story, and journey. We want to own our responsibility to uphold integrity in our storytelling and our messaging. And if there's a language barrier, we want to find an able translator. Thankfully, that's something we've consistently been able to do, and we want to keep doing it. All right, so this is another item that I'm very passionate about, using images responsibly. I'm a bit of a photographer, and so that ups the amount of interest I hold in this, but even if I wasn't, I'd hope that this is something I'd still value. Thea Soa says that when people portray us as victims, they don't want to ask us about solutions, because people don't ask victims for solutions. You think about that image I showed you at the beginning from like an old infomercial. Is anyone going to come to those children thinking that they're the solution to the problem that they're facing, realistically, just based off that image? Probably not. But there are different images we could show that accomplish this. Take a look at this one. To just think for a second what impression this image might have on you. Now, it's not the most professional in the world. In fact, you can kind of see somebody didn't take the time stamp off back in 2010. His face is actually out of focus. It's a bit blurry, and more so, it's out of the light. His face is actually more obscured by the shadows, and the lighting is brighter and even a bit harsh in the background on the trees. His facial expression is very serious, and sometimes a serious face is okay, but this one, you're not quite sure if he's sad or what's going on. It's not the most positive looking facial expression, I guess we could say. Let's compare that with a different image. This is actually the same person, Facundo, taken 5 or 6 years later in the Dominican Republic. So what do we see here? You can see that his face actually serves as the focal point. This image, just all the contours of the lines and shapes and textures going on, even the tree in the background, kind of lead your eye right towards the center of his face. And that's cool because it's as if he's pulling you into his world. The angle that his body is positioned in is almost saying, like, come, let me show you. The lighting is much improved. The lighting on the back looks fine. It's a good green color. You can see that it's a lush landscape he has going on. And the lighting on his face especially is gentle. It's well lit, and his facial features aren't obscured. And pay attention to his facial expression too. It's not exactly a smile, but it's not a negative look either. It's got curiosity, maybe some optimism, and I'm seeing strength and resolve. Good images do a lot of good. A good photo will stop people in their tracks. There is so much research and data gathered just on how the image of a face naturally pulls the human eyeball. It's a part of our human nature and our developed sense of being social beings. They help build people's trust. People want to see what they're contributing towards, and shy of being able to visit, which right now is really off limits, but even when it's not a pandemic, it's still difficult to hop in a plane and go to Haiti or Africa or something. Images help you get a look into what the scenario is like. They make an impression. I always want to push us to go for as high quality photos as we can manage. It says a lot about us as an organization and what we care about, what we strive for in terms of quality. I want the quality of our images to match the quality of our programs and our efforts on the ground. Images create context. So take a look at this photo from Burundi. Just by looking at this, you can see how steep the hillside is that these people have to farm. You can see that it's often rocky land that they have to work with. You can also see the communal nature of what planting trees often looks like. You can get a sense for what people wear and just what life looks like day to day for the folks who are involved in our program. Even things like the ages of people who are planting, men and women. All that this photo says in way fewer words than I could ever dream of conveying all that in. Good images also provoke empathy. You can really see the humanity in the other person who your support is going towards, and that makes a big deal of difference. This is something we send to all of our international partners. Like I said, they play a big role in getting stories to us, especially now when there's travel restrictions. These are our international photography standards. They address everything from lighting to the facial expression we want. We encourage and try and provide our partners with appropriate equipment and guidelines for file sizes, that sort of thing, to ensure that the photos coming in are high quality. Once we receive them, whether they come from our partners or from another source, we have our own set of internal controls to make sure we're using high quality, ethical, recent photos. We use the STAR system here. I won't go through item by item, that might take a lot, but generally they address their relevance to partner's story, lighting, the way the subject is presented, quality, creativity, and anything below 4 or 5 stars, really, we try and stay away from. We want to aim to do our best. We also have a similar rubric for the stories that we keep and curate in our database. One thing to be aware of is the fact that cameras were not designed for black and brown skin. And those are the skin tones of the people we work with in the countries and the places we work. There is this article called Teaching the Camera to See My Skin, and it goes over some of the history of how camera technology evolved. When you think back to the days where film was more of the norm, the technician working back in the development room was often comparing the final product with what was called a Shirley card. It was actually named after the white woman who was on these cards, Shirley, I'm guessing. And so the way that the rest of an image was calibrated was to get it right around Shirley's face. But what happens when our person isn't Shirley, but someone in the Dominican Republic or Haiti or the Congo with much darker skin, is that trying to use that same technology results in a lot of times faces being obscured, facial features being put in the dark, uneven, harsh lighting, skin tones just not coming across right. And so that's something we actively try to look out for. In that article I mentioned earlier, it was written by a black photographer. She says that the frame says how the photographer sees you. And when she saw images, old photos of her and her mom from the 80s taken in film, she couldn't help but feel that what the photographer was seeing was so different from how she saw herself. She was asking, is that how you see me? Could you not see blackness, its varying tones and textures? She started to wonder, do you see all of us this way? And look, I know you might be thinking, well, like, aren't things better now? Isn't digital photography, doesn't that give us better tools to work with? It can be, but a lot of these tools were still developed based off of that old technology and with the same consumer market in mind. So it's something we have to be mindful of and train our eyes to see when we're looking at our images, making sure our partners, their facial features, everything is being shown in a flattering and dignifying way. We want to uphold the dignity of our constituents through empowering imagery, as well as messages that motivate engagement and inspire hope, staying away from those exploitative images. We don't want to use images, footage, or words that sensationalize or stereotype a person or situation. So there you have it. So if showing an image of a malnourished child in stark, contrasting black and white, holding up an empty plate, lacking in food, is one way of exploiting poverty, that's kind of on one end of a spectrum of unhealthy extremes. There's another end of that spectrum that is sugarcoating poverty and romanticizing people's actual experiences of misery and hardship. We want to avoid that, to be clear. Chimamanda Adichie says that stories can be used to break the dignity of people, and they can also be used to repair their broken sense of identity. In order to do that, we need to tell the whole story. We can't just skip over to the happy parts, rush to the happy ending. And we need to be honest about the hard things our partners have and can, in many cases, continue to experience. Have you ever heard somebody say this? Wow, these people have so little, and yet they're so happy. Or maybe you've encountered a story told by an organization that seemed a little too eager to get to the happy ending. Like, yeah, there's poverty in the world, but it's gonna be okay because Johnny now has a meal. There's a lot of other need out there. Here's another thing. I've come across the phrase gringo enlightenment more and more these days. At first I wasn't sure what it meant, but I had a clue. And it turned out to be that thing where someone's telling a story of going to maybe going on a missions trip or a volunteer trip and meeting these people, and they've come back a changed person. Like this poor community that they saw has totally changed their perspective on life and the world and everything. And you hear that story a lot. And in that example and in all these examples, here's the issue. They all contain a little bit of truth. So you will go to a community with high rates of poverty and see people who struggle through that, who still experience joy. And you'll see moms loving their babies and kids playing together. And yes, joy coexists. But you don't want to tell a selective story that leaves other important things out of the frame. And the example of gringo enlightenment. Yes, if you visit a community that has fewer resources, you will have your perspective challenged. And, hopefully you do come back a changed person in some ways. And that's not a bad thing. The problem is when the story becomes centered on your personal development. And suddenly the people of that community are props or just supporting characters in your story, and they're being decentered from their own experience. So how can we avoid this? We must truthfully represent situations and stories in ways that educate our audiences of the realities, the complexities, and the nuances of the issues we advocate for. I'll be honest in saying it's a tough tension to work through. It's tough to strike it, but it is something that we continue to strive for. Informed consent. This is a really big deal, right? The UN released this document, Time to Listen, hearing people on the receiving end of international aid, and a member of a community highlighted this phrase that really sticks with me. There should be nothing said about us without us. And so here's what informed consent looks like to us. It means that people are giving us permission to share their story, and they know how we're going to share it, why we're sharing it. They at least have a sense in a way that well enough understood by them that these are going to be used in educational tools or fundraising tools, and that we're reaching out to generally to people who support the organization that they're partnered with, or people who have the potential to support and who are interested in inviting on board. They also need to know that they can say no. They can opt out. Our international partners, working with local populations everywhere we go. That's another big advantage of that, is they're able to get people to say no in a way where it doesn't feel like they're being influenced by us outsiders and different power dynamics or anything like that. And then we want to document this permission. We want to make sure that we have a good paper trail, just to make sure we're upholding integrity and everything can check out and be above water. Here's just one example of that. This is our written agreement with our partnering organizations in every country. It highlights that they're responsible to secure participants' permissions for us to use their stories and photos. Here's another example that we have in writing. It's a release form of group participants. So down to the level of the individual community group, we're looking to secure this permission. Here's a few other safeguards we have in place to make sure that, we're not putting anyone at risk or just doing anything against their wishes. When necessary, we'll use pseudonyms. There are a few places we work in where there are some sensitive security situations, and we want to make sure we're not putting anyone in harm's way. There's really no need for us to use people's full names. So again, we can just go off of first names, and that's helpful from a security standpoint. Geographically, when we're talking about a community, we're talking about a watershed. That's a pretty general, a watershed are the natural boundaries of an area. It's larger, much larger than talking about an individual village. And oftentimes watershed names aren't even easy to find on a map. So it's, and again, another bonus thing we can do to protect the privacy of the people we work with. All this would be defeated if we didn't ask people, photographers, to turn off their geotagging. So a lot of phones have the built-in technology to tell you where a photo was taken when it gets taken. So when people go on trips with us, we ask them to turn off that feature of their phone. And we also have them signing waivers with regards to how they're going to use these photos as well. A lot of this stuff are more recent developments. And so these not just represent things we do, but things we're striving for in ways we continue to seek to get better at ethical storytelling. So we want to be sure to explain to constituents the purpose of their story, where it's going to be used, answer questions that they might have before we start filming or taking pictures or recording. We want to check to make sure that they want to be named or identified, and we want to act based on their wishes. We want to use all of our images and messages with a full understanding, participation, and permission of the constituents. In the case of a minor, their legal guardian. It's not often that in our work we're talking to kids, but sometimes it happens, and when it does, we want to make sure we're responding appropriately. And we want to abide by international law. There's a lot of standards and protocols around this. One notable one is the UN's Convention of the Rights of the Child. And there are a good number of others as well. All right, here's another big one. We want to make sure we are being humble. I get asked often a lot about the white savior complex and how does that factor into our storytelling? How do we avoid that narrative? If you're not familiar with what the white savior complex is, let's start here. The white savior complex refers to a narrative that glorifies the actions of a white person that's done to help a non-white person. And the way that the story is told emphasizes the non-white person's lack of agency. Basically, life happens to them, and it minimizes their own virtue. So the changes, the positive impact is the result of the white savior's intervention, not because of their own virtue or character or anything like that. It's a common critique of many international development institutions. Okay, so here we have two photos. The one on the left looks a bit like an image I showed you earlier. It's kids in need, looking malnourished, holding empty plates in black and white. I have nothing against black and white photography, okay? Those are just two of the examples I brought up. There are a lot of other problems. The fact that it's in black and white isn't necessarily one of them. The contrast might be a bit played up for dramatic effect, but I don't want to make black and white photographers feel guilty. That's not what this is about. On the right here, we have another image. The kids look happier. It's a more positive aesthetic, less guilt-based. But you know what? It still centers on the volunteers' heroism, and it still kind of makes the identities of the children secondary. So you see a sense of disempowerment among the people who are participating in a program, the lack of local agency, lack of local leadership. What you're not seeing in these photos is potential that are found in communities of color, indigenous communities, communities abroad. And you continue to see harmful stereotypes being furthered and perpetuated. I don't want to name and shame specific organizations and just call out people. Thankfully, on Instagram, there's a parody account of a white savior Barbie visiting different international sites. And sometimes it's a little bit easier to see the absurdity when it's presented to you through a Mattel Barbie doll. So you have comments like just taking a slum fee amidst this dire poverty and need, feeling #blessed and #thankful that I have so much more than this and don't have to live this way. Lots of hashtags. Slum life. This little one's greatest joy in all of her life is sitting on my lap and drinking Coca-Cola. Really. Can't say I blame her. My quads are on fleek. Okay, so yeah. It's a parody account. These posts in real life are cringeworthy, but that's not to say there aren't real. This account exists because real life posts that aren't too dissimilar exist. Who needs a formal education to teach in Africa? Not me. All I need is some chalk and a dose of optimism. That's so sad that they don't have enough trained teachers here. You get where this is going, right? Especially when you're coming in with misguided optimism without the trained background, just thinking that's all it takes to make a difference. It's really a kind of a backhanded insult to these communities in a lot of ways. So how can we do better? How can we stay humble? How can we check ourselves in addition to being open to feedback and checking ourselves? I think one big takeaway is to give credit where credit's actually due. In most places around the world where you see change happening, you'll find locals who are in the lead. That's a key ingredient to a lot of effective change. I really appreciate working for Plant with Purpose because this is baked into our model. We literally have a independent, nationally based partner in every country we work in. And even further down to the community level, we always try and hyper-localize everything as much as possible. So when talking about successes, I can share the credit and attribute it to the people who are really on the ground, driving the change on the front lines of their community. Another big one is to keep going with this "we are not the savior" refrain. What better counter to the white savior complex than to pay more attention to the actual savior. Again, to repeat something our CEO, Scott Saban, says a lot, our planet already has a savior, and it's not us. And he was brown, too. I guess that's worth noting. We want to ask for feedback from our constituents and incorporate this feedback into the final story. Hold a posture of humility and learning. Recognize that failures can be our biggest educators. You want to seek advice. We have peers in this field who are going through the same thing, who have expertise in this area, and we want to lean on those connections to see if a particular story or message or image just doesn't match what we want from our ethical storytelling principles. And finally, we need to know when we're willing to walk away. We need to know when there might be a great story that has the potential to bring in lots of money because it pulls at the heartstrings. We can't tell that story with the integrity that we commit to. Then we need to be willing to just walk away from it and cut that loss. Finally, a big function of ethical storytelling is facilitating connection. Now, I don't want this presentation to make it seem like ethical storytelling is just this laundry list of don'ts. There's actually a lot of do's, a lot of proactive things you can do to promote ethical storytelling. And a big one is to facilitate connection, to take apart the narrative of us versus them. Some of you may have heard this quote before. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your alliteration is bound up with mine, then let us work together. It's a quote by Lilla Watson. She's an Aboriginal activist from Australia. And that captures a lot of my expectations for what a good, healthy, working relationship in the international development world looks like. People are our partners, not our projects. That's something we emphasize here a lot at Plant with Purpose. And our storytelling can really help drive that point home. So there's this paradox that is just so true to the work I find myself doing all the time. It's that all around the world, people are amazingly diverse and different, and yet also so the same and interconnected. When I think of the diversity of people, it reminds me to respect the fact that our partners live in contexts and situations that I will never fully understand. I don't know what it's like to live in their level of extreme poverty. I don't want to be presumptive in thinking that I really have the ability to speak on that with the authority that experience brings. At the same time, there is a common humanity to each of us. All of us bear the image of God, and that ties us together. Working in the environmental sphere further drives home that point that all of life is so deeply intertwined and interconnected. And so eliminating the gap between us versus them is something we strive to do. I want to share a favorite example of mine from World Relief. They are, like us, they're an international Christian organization. They work in dozens of countries. And this is something that they released a few years ago for the International Women's Day. Let me just play a snippet of their Thank God for Women campaign.
She extends her hands to the needy. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her.
Okay, so here's what I love about that video is it takes women in the places they work, and it takes women in the in settings familiar to their audience and their donor base, and they juxtapose them side by side. You see one after you see the other. And it reminds us that all around the world, women are raising families and doing good work and creating beauty and overcoming hardship, whether that's the walk to get clean water, whether that's training for a marathon or teaching kids how to read. It's very unifying. It's beautiful. The voiceover of Proverbs 31 was amazing. And so this is an example, I think, of how storytelling can, in a beautiful, compelling way, remind us of our connection and our responsibility to one another. So to do this, to facilitate connection, just remember, always put people first and tell other people's stories the way we would want our stories told. A big important thing is just accountability really matters. I often say at Plant with Purpose, if we're going to be writing about our partners on Facebook, we need to do so in a way that anticipates, hey, they might be on Facebook. I used to say that hypothetically, but it's increasingly true. We actually have had a few of our partners find us on social media and add us as friends or whatever you do on each platform. And we want it to be the case where if they saw the way we were telling their story, that they felt good about it, that they felt encouraged and supported and uplifted, and it was just the way they would have wanted it told. Here is a cool positive example of that. A few years ago, we featured Eleuterio he featured him in a video. We've also featured him in our annual report. And on a trip to Oaxaca, one of our fundraisers was able to bring a copy of that report and show it to Eleuterio and his wife Yolanda. And they were really excited to see their presentation of their story in some of our published materials. Being able to do that, to bring our materials back to our partners and to have it seen with a sense of pride and satisfaction, it's something we want to strive for. One other way we are committed to accountability is we have actually signed the Ethical Storytelling Pledge. You've seen the principles listed out throughout this presentation, but I'd recommend, especially if you're watching and you maybe work with another nonprofit organization or a ministry of some sort, or even if you just care about this and want to dive deeper, ethicalstorytelling.com has a bunch of great resources that cover some of the finer details of things I've gone over. And there's also a pledge you might want to commit your church, your ministry, your nonprofit to as well. It's something we've done, and I highly recommend. So yeah, back to the whole thing. Ethical storytelling isn't easy. It's a lot of things in tension with one another, things to look out for and be careful with. At the end of the day, though, it's the only way we want to tell our stories. It is how we do things, but I think it's more than that. It is also the way we do things, and it's the thing itself. It's all about empowering others, responding to human dignity in a way that is ethical and just and appropriate. We have to start seeing people as going through problems instead of seeing people as problems. I love the way Terence Lester puts that. And it matches so closely something we say at Plant with Purpose a lot. Our participants, the people we work with, they're our partners, not our projects. And we want them to be involved and their dignity upheld every part of the way. Thank you for your time. I'm glad that this is something that you value enough to sit through this presentation with. Feel free to follow up with any questions that I might be able to take via email or anything. I want to share just a few resources that helped shape this presentation. So again, I mentioned ethicalstorytelling.com. If you go to that/pledge, you can take the pledge yourself. I also recommend The Development Element by Georgetown University. There's the link there. It's a bit long. Maybe take a screenshot of this page or something. It's a document compiled by master's students in an international development program at Georgetown, highlighting the just tropes and the way this conversation is evolving, important things to think about. Danger of a Single Story, the TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Highly recommend. It's one of my favorite TED Talks. Teaching the Camera to See My Skin, that article is up on BuzzFeed. That's great if you want to dive more into some of what I was talking about with photography and cameras and all that. The Narrative Project is similar to Ethical Storytelling. You'll find a lot of big name development organizations signed on there, lots of resources as well. And if you're more interested in the topic of not wanting to sugarcoat poverty, I recommend this article called The Opposite of Poverty Porn, Erasing Clients from Storytelling. You can check that out in the link below as well. Thank you so much. Again, I'm just happy that this is something that you care enough about to sit through this presentation with. If you want to learn more about Plant with Purpose, find out about our work, or even support it, check out plantwithpurpose.org. And if you want to stay tuned for the stories that we're telling, follow us on social media. We're at PlantWPurpose. On Instagram, for every new follower we get to plant a tree. So that's really cool. If you aren't following us already, there you go. Just hit follow, and a tree starts to grow. All right, I'm Philippe Lazaro. Thank you so much. Take care.